Okay, we're going to talk now about an introduction to editorials. And as you can see from the quote on the front page here, a quote from Vermont C. Royster saying the editorial page of the paper should begin where the rest of the paper leaves off. So the implication there is that when we're writing an editorial, we're not just writing an article that could be found in the rest of the newspaper, we're actually writing something that goes beyond those articles and adds something more to it. So an editorial versus an article. Articles are strictly fact-based. They're the kind of things that we're used to reading when we look in a newspaper, or whether we read that online or perhaps see that on TV news. It's a factual report, a representation of what's happened. Editorials, on the other hand, are interpretive or opinionative. So they're more than just a news story. However, it's really important to remember that when we talk about a formal editorial, it's actually something that represents the opinion of the newspaper or the publication as a whole. It's not a personal individual opinion, although it can actually be your personal individual opinion. It's published in a way that means that it represents the opinion of the whole newspaper. So because of that, we avoid the use of the first person, saying things like I believe or I think or I feel. And those sorts of words tend to undermine the persuasivity of your piece anyway, so it's a good idea to avoid them anyway. Even though it's an opinion piece, it's really important that the article is carefully researched. It absolutely must be accurate. You can't get away with fudging facts and figures for the sake of being persuasive. From a practical level, this is because if you're publishing a formal editorial and you're representing your newspaper or publication in doing so, you don't want to run the risk of readers finding inaccuracies in your work and calling into question then the reputation of the newspaper as a whole. Another thing to be really aware of when you're doing an editorial is to make sure that you don't leave any doubt as to what the actual stance is that you're arguing in your piece. It can be easy when you're not used to writing editorials to sort of waffle to and fro and to show both sides of the story and to try and be balanced in your opinion. And that's okay, you're allowed to be balanced, but by the same token, the reader has to come away from your editorial piece knowing what your opinion was on a topic. So you can't really just sit there and go, oh, well, it could be this or it could be that. It all depends. What does it depend on? What are you actually trying to make your reader think or feel or believe or understand here? That needs to be really clear. And it's something that you obviously need to spend a lot of time considering before you actually start writing your editorial. So who is your audience? What do you want them to get out of this? There are lots and lots of different ways that you can structure an editorial. It's not as formal a structure as something like an essay. There are so a couple of suggestions that we've got here. This is the first suggestion. Number 1, state the subject and your position on the subject in the introduction. Number 2, discuss the opposing points of view. Number 3, prove your position with supporting details. And number 4, draw a conclusion. Those of you who are good at English might recognise this as being somewhat similar to a discuss essay, which is true. But of course, being an editorial, you don't need to adhere quite so strictly to that format. Certainly in terms of length of paragraph and things like that, there's a lot more room for flexibility. Another alternative when it comes to structuring your editorial is the SPECS method. So S, state the problem or situation. P, state your position. E, give evidence to support your position. C, state and refute the position of the opposition in your conclusion. And S, offer 2 possible solutions to the problem. You can see that the beginning of SPECS is very, very similar to the method that we saw on the previous slide. Where it differs is that we're stating and refuting the position of the opposition very clearly in one step and towards the end of our piece, rather than putting both sides of the argument up front. This side puts your position up, this method puts your position up front and then ends by saying, the opposition might believe this, but here's why they're wrong. And it also concludes by offering 2 possible solutions to the problem. So obviously this is going to be more useful for a topic where you need to present solutions to the issue that you can see, rather than a topic where you're just discussing an issue or something like that. When you're writing an editorial, context is the most important thing to bear in mind. You must know clearly who your intended audience is. You must know clearly what your intended audience will already know about your issue. You must know clearly what your intended audience believes about your issue, which sometimes overlaps with what they know, but it can also be separate. And you must know clearly what your intended audience values in order to most effectively persuade them. So an example of that, using highly emotive language to appeal to an audience that's primarily male, upper class, well-educated and STEM oriented, STEM being science, technology, engineering and maths, probably won't work as well for them as using facts and hard data and a really logical analysis of the issue. In contrast, facts, data, charts, analysis, those sorts of things are probably not the best way to win over a primary school audience. They are obviously going to be more susceptible to emotive language and to persuasive techniques and things like, and to rhetoric. So you must know your audience. You must know what they value so that you can tap into that. If this is an audience that's going to value equality and justice, then those are obviously things that you can highlight, and you can assume that if you talk about those concepts, your audience is going to be on side with you. Knowing who your audience is and knowing what they value can allow you to make some shortcuts, because instead of having to explain and justify everything that you're saying from the ground up, you can say things like, yes, we believe everybody should be equal, and you can assume that your audience is going to agree with you. Whereas if you're writing for a different audience who doesn't perhaps value that, then you can't automatically assume out of the gate that they're going to agree when you say that, and so you have to spend more time justifying that part of your argument. So hopefully that shows you why it's really important to know who your intended audience is and to know what it is that they're going to know, believe, and value about your issue before you start writing. So there are three main types of editorials: explanatory, evaluative, and persuasive. An explanatory editorial, as it says right there in the title, is an editorial that aims to explain. So it's somewhat like an essay, and it's aiming to interpret or to inform rather than to argue a particular point of view. It's showing the evidence, it's showing the data, and it's wanting to get people thinking about a particular issue, but it's mostly factual. It's designed to convey the facts and to convey information. The editorial aspect coming in to distinguish it just from an article comes in the way that the facts are interpreted. So there is some sort of interpretive slant there in the conclusions that they draw from the evidence. An evaluative editorial is obviously seeking to evaluate an action or a situation or something else like that. So to determine whether the action situation is right, wrong, good, bad, effective, ineffective, those sorts of things. And instead of approaching the situation going, okay, well, let's have a discussion and try to figure out whether this is effective or not, an editorial is usually coming at the issue with their mind already made up, trying to prove either, yes, this is effective, no, this is not effective, yes, this is right, no, this is wrong, and then seeking to convey that opinion to their audience. So because of this, any criticism that they offer must be constructive. So instead of just blindly tearing down the opposition, they have to actually be able to point out logically and constructively what it is that's actually wrong with the opposition's point of view. So if something's wrong, what is actually a possible solution to this? What can we do better? Being positive as well, so pointing out the good aspects of what the situation or the action is at the moment, can actually help to engender trust in your readers. So rather than blindly going in and being scathingly criticizing of this action or this situation, if you can go in and say, well, these are the good aspects of it, then that's actually a way to show readers that you're trustworthy, to show them that you're not being biased, that you're not being blinded by your opinion, that you're able to recognize some good things that have happened. And then following that up with your constructive criticism to be able to say, well, here are the good things, there are some bad things, and this is my suggestion for fixing them. So that's a really solid framework to come at this idea of, wanting to persuade your reader towards your opinion. So evaluative editorials rely on specificity to work really well. You need to be able to be very specific about the good, the bad, and the possible solutions rather than just vague overviews. And the basic purpose of this obviously is to establish understanding of the complexities of an issue, or some of them anyway, because obviously editorials usually only 700 to 800 words long, so you don't have time to establish understanding of every complexity of the entire issue from every possible angle. But as opposed to the other two types of editorials, there's more focus on wanting to understand the complexities of what's going on. In contrast, a persuasive editorial doesn't really mind too much about whether the reader comes away with a good understanding of the issue. They just want the reader to come away with a desire to act on the issue. So the basic purpose is to persuade the reader to do something, which means that they need to include a call to action. And usually that call to action is added at the very end, right in the conclusion, so that the article ends with something like, if you care about this, you should go and do this now. Write to your local minister about this issue. Here's how. We invite you to, share this issue on your social media to raise awareness. Things like that are called call to actions. And this action is prioritized, as I said, over an understanding of complexities of the issue. This also means that persuasive editorials have to be very specific as well, but in a different way. Instead of being specific about the pros and cons of the situation, persuasive editorials have to be very specific about what they want the reader to do and why they want the reader to do this. Now, that why they want the reader to do this part means that they rely a lot more on overt persuasive techniques than other editorial types. So things like emotive language, rhetoric, all your different poetic devices, things like that are going to be a lot more overt, a lot more noticeable, and a lot more important in a persuasive editorial than the other two editorials. And even more so than the other two forms of editorial, you really have to work on establishing a position of trust with the reader, because what you're trying to do is trying to inspire them to act. And we all know that if someone we don't trust or we don't like is telling us to go and do something, we're not very likely to actually go and do it. So you need to be using, things like your personal pronouns, we, together, forming that bond between the writer and the audience, and showing that you are a trustworthy person, that you've got, appealing to logic, appealing to emotion, to show that your side of the argument is balanced and sensible and obvious, and that, of course, this is the way that everybody should think, and so, of course, they should go and do this act now. Is really important to establishing that trust and making the reader then want to act. Another way to do that as well is persuasive editorials can often be a lot more personal, so they rely on personal anecdotes and things, whereas an evaluative editorial is likely to rely on facts and charts and data. Persuasive editorials are likely to be a lot more humanized, so we look at the human face of the issue, looking at personal anecdotes, the way that this is impacted on particular people, particular communities, and really selling that human aspect of it in order to make people connect emotionally with the issue. So there are 8 key points to writing a really good editorial. Number 1, focus on a central theme. Really, really be narrow in your theme. You've only got a short amount of word count. You can't possibly focus on every aspect of the issue. Develop a really clear, cohesive thesis and stick to it. Number 2, know the viewpoint that you have to refute. Who are you arguing against, and what are their arguments going to be, and how are you going to refute those? Number 3, make inductive arguments. So this just means that make sure your arguments are logical and rational, and that they aren't based on sweeping generalizations that other people could really easily disagree with. If you want to look more at the idea of inductive arguments, there's a PowerPoint that I'm going to refer to you on the next slide. Go away and read that one for more information. Number 4, base moral evaluations on the facts. Even if they are moral, they're still going to hold a lot more weight if it's factually based. And likewise, number 5, rely on the reader's implicit knowledge and values. So this is where knowing your audience is really important. Know what they value so that you can rely on that. Number 6, it's more important to be clear than eloquent. We always strive for clarity. Number 7, end with your call to action. And number 8, don't forget that good writing comes from exhaustive editing. You can never expect your first draft to be brilliant. Keep editing until it gets to where you want. 2 other PowerPoints that I'd like you to go away and have a look at now if you're in my class. Go go away and have a look at writing a convincing editorial and writing editorials a model and example.